So the last couple of videos I've done have been comparative analyses, taking a few different pieces and seeing what they have in common. For this video, I wanted to take one relatively short piece and just analyze it as thoroughly as possible, and the piece I chose is Final Fantasy VII's Victory Fanfare. Before we dive in, it's important to know where the song's coming from. Up until 7, the Final Fantasy games all used a reorchestrated version of the original Victory theme, featuring a pretty typical 1 flat 6 flat 7 1 walk-up. This chord progression has been called the Mario Cadence because of its iconic use as the level complete theme in the original Super Mario Bros. And now has become synonymous with Victory music in general. The original Victory theme's melody was pretty straightforward, using exclusively the root of each chord for the opening fanfare. The bass keeps this from being too redundant by giving us a little more motion and landing on the 5th for the C flat and D flat chords.
I hate having to say C flat so much you have no idea. I want to just say B, but technically it is C flat and I feel like I have to maintain some level of professionalism, and you know how pedantic music theory nerds can be.
After the 2-bar fanfare, we get this jolly little tune. This is actually a good example of Antecedent Consequent period, which is a simple melodic structure that boils down to a kind of question and answer form. The first bar gives us our main motif, a 5-4-5-4 over the 1 chord. This contour is moved up to the 1-7-1-7 of the subsequent flat 7 chord, and then we get a slightly altered version of this phrase that jumps down to an F, which is the 2 in the key of E flat and the 3rd of the underlying D flat chord. So here we have our first full melodic statement, ending on a note found in the key's dominant chord. This is what makes it sound like a question. Just like how in harmony a 5 chord wants to resolve to 1, in melody the chord tones of a 5 chord usually want to resolve to a chord tone of the 1 chord. Denying that makes it so the music doesn't feel complete yet, and it still wants to keep going. This is called the antecedent. The next phrase is an exact duplicate of the first, except instead of running down to an F, we jump up to an E flat, the tonic. The tonic, being the most stable note in a scale, is the perfect choice for when you want a phrase to sound finished. It's nice and resolved, and it doesn't feel like it has to keep going. This is the consequent. Think of the first phrase as asking a question, and the second phrase as giving the answer. Nobuo Uematsu doesn't perfectly stick to this structure though, and we'll see why in a minute. To keep cohesiveness with the intro, Uematsu exclusively uses the 1, flat 7, and flat 6 chords in the second section. We get a 1 flat 7 vamp for most of it, very common for heroic and fantasy music, but then on the last bar over our nice resolved E flat in the melody, we get this flat 6 chord out of left field, undercutting the melodic resolution. Here's what it would sound like with a more typical 5-1 ending. Now, back to the Uematsu version. Playing with our expectations as listeners is the mark of a really great composer.
I thought this video was about Final Fantasy VII.
Okay. On the note of playing with our expectations, let's take a look at the Final Fantasy VII Victory Fanfare. The opening melody is completely preserved from the original theme and sets the expectation that we're in for a little more of the same. The first bar is pretty much the same as the original, with just a little bit of foreshadowing for what's to come with the alteration of the flat 6 chord. Instead of a straight A flat major, we get an A flat sus, which introduces us to the D flat note. This note is reinforced in the bass, making it an A flat sus over D flat. This is foreshadowing because instead of resolving nicely to the 1, the flat 7 deceptively resolves up to the flat 2 D flat major. Hearing the D flat note introduced a bar earlier keeps this deceptive resolution sounding cohesive to the rest of the music, but it's still such a surprising move that it catches us totally off guard. The melody resolving to the tonic, or at least what we thought was the tonic, adds to the shock of this resolution, and it works because the 1 of the 1 chord becomes the major 7 of the flat 2 chord. This sort of deceptive resolution is pretty common in jazz settings. What adds to it in this song is the fact that the melody entirely fits into the D flat major scale, so even though it's a surprising move, it doesn't sound like it's a mistake. Also, look at the way the inner voices slide around in these first 2 bars, especially this bottom voice. After jumping down to foreshadow the D flat, it moves up by a semitone before giving us this ascending line that seamlessly lands on the ninth of the flat 2 chord as part of this awesome voicing. I love how this sounds, especially the way the triplet bass line underneath it gives way to a 16th note D flat major 7 arpeggio to ramp up the excitement and switch gears for the next section. Before we get to the next section though, I want to talk a little bit about the first beat of the second bar. At first I had labeled it as an F minor chord moving to a B flat minor chord, because technically that's what it is. But I think it's better to label the whole bar as D flat because of two things. Firstly, all of the notes fit into the D flat major 7 chord except for the B flat, which we can say is just there for the purpose of keeping the original theme's melody intact. Secondly, the run up in the bass follows a D flat pentatonic scale, so you can kind of hear it either way. It simultaneously harmonizes the chords on top as a 3-6-1 in D flat, and works purely as a diatonic run up to D flat major. Neither is wrong, but it moves so quick and the 3-6-1 is such a weak chord progression that I think it fits better to just consider the whole bar to be an elaboration on a D flat chord. Anyways, after this section, we move on to a nice antecedent consequent section that uses the intro's harmony to maintain a cohesive whole. I'm just kidding, this is where it gets really intense. Trying to decide what key to put this section in wasn't super easy. I opted for F minor, partially because of where it sits in the phrase, and partially because the only real resolution that happens in the section lands on F minor, but ultimately because that's just what feels the most like home to me. But, seeing as how half of the chords don't fit into functional F minor harmony, you could say it's debatable. Firstly, let's establish the arrangement of this section. We have a bass note hitting this rhythm, kind of low in the mix. Then we have a staccato chord stab happening a little higher in the mix. And then highest in the mix we have the 16th note line. This line is kind of a combination of the other two parts because it always outlines the exact same chord being played in the staccato accompaniment while accenting the same rhythm that the bass is laying down. Also, I'd be remiss not to mention this fat drum beat. Now let's take a look at this harmony. We have our ostensible one, F minor, moving to a 2 sus F over G. This is already pretty weird. I think Uematsu was trying to see how many chords he could make while moving the notes in the chords as little as possible. If you look at them, you see how each one changes by just one semitone, giving us F minor to F minor to E augmented. The way the bass harmonizes these chords though changes them, so instead we get an F minor, F over G, D flat major 7, and this thing. Okay, so this is how I classify this chord. E augmented is identical to both C augmented and A flat augmented because of the augmented chord's symmetrical structure. C is the dominant of F, and raising the 5 on a dominant chord to add a little extra tension is very common, especially in a minor key where the sharp 5 of the dominant chord already naturally occurs in the parent scale as the third of the minor 1 chord. What's also very common, especially in the jazz community, is substituting the 5 chord with a flat 2 chord. Those guys just sub out everything for flat 2, don't they? Well, this works so well because the voice leading that makes the 5-7-1 sound the way it does, namely the 4-3 and 7-1 motion, is still intact in a flat 2-7-1 progression. Only the 3 and 7 of the 5 chord are now the 7 and 3 of the flat 2 chord. We call this a tritone substitution because the flat 2 is a tritone away from the 5 chord. The more you know. So, this C augmented over G flat is kind of a combination of both. We have the bass giving us a tritone sub, while the upper harmonies give us an augmented dominant. The fact that this bar resolves back to our 1 chord supports this interpretation of the harmony. Now we're back to our established progression with an F minor to F over G before Uematsu takes the chromatic movement to another level by moving every part of this bar up a semitone, giving us a G flat over A flat, while bringing in the lush string crescendo. This G flat over A flat moves two of its notes up a semitone this time to give us a G minor over A flat, or an A flat major 7 sharp 11 sus 2. These slash chords, which are just a triad over a root that is not the root of the triad, are also very common in jazz music. They almost always relate to a more typical chord label, but the specific voicing gives them a really unique flavor. We actually have quite a few cool examples in this piece. The flat 7 over 1, or the F over G, the sharp 4 augmented over 1, or the C augmented over G flat, and the minor 7 over 1, or the G minor over A flat. Anyways, this G minor over A flat back to the F minor at the top isn't really a resolution in a traditional sense. This whole piece is a great example of non-functional harmony, actually. The chords eschew a traditional framework in favor of a more abstract way of creating tension and release. If functional harmony is like a movie where our hero fights the baddie, gets the girl, and saves the day, this piece is more like an art house picture. I hope you enjoyed me talking about a song for 10 times as long as it takes to actually listen to it, and thank you for watching.